So I'm going to ask my first question to Dr. Cerf. Vint is famous for some critical requests for comments, the RFCs that made the internet what it is. But he's also famous for one that was not about the technology of the internet, but the philosophy of the internet. And the RFC in this case is RFC 3271. The internet is for everybody. That was what it was called. A 2002 kind of manifesto about the future that he hoped for. And so this is the Vint, your title now at Google has been Chief Internet Evangelist. And you've explained how the internet is getting both very big, but also very small. Very big, he talked in 2002 about an interplanetary internet. But he's also talking nowadays about a nanoscale internet. So when the internet is in everything, how do you think about where the internet is, where it's going on both those huge and micro scales?
Wow, okay, and you want an answer in 25 words or less, right? Give 3 examples. First of all, let me explain the title. I did not ask for that title. When I joined Google in 2005, they said, "What title do you want?" And I said, "Archduke." And Larry and Eric and Sergey went away, and they came back, and they said, "You know, the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. Maybe that's a bad title. Why don't you be our chief internet evangelist?" It is sometimes misunderstood as a religious title. And when I was in Moscow lecturing, I was asked in public at the end of my lecture, "Do you believe in God?" And so I thought that was a pretty personal question to ask in public. And I said, "Well, I'm geek orthodox." and so that's my philosophy. To come back to the internet is for everyone, I still believe that. Keep in mind that we are sort of at the crossing point of about half the world's population has direct access to internet by one means or another, not necessarily always at the highest speeds, often with mobiles, frequently with 4G or maybe 3G or sometimes Wi-Fi. I still believe that the internet has the potential to be an extremely useful tool for everybody, and it should be available to everyone. It shouldn't be forced down their throats. But as Laura has written very well in this book, it is arriving without necessarily our consent. As it gets into small devices like appliances and sensors and things like that, we don't even necessarily know that it's present. So it is now an issue because when I wrote that in 2002, you did have a choice. Not everyone was forced to use it. You had to do something to get online, turn on your laptop or at that point there weren't any mobiles, smartphones, but there were, and I guess there were tablets, but maybe. In any case, now it's no longer something that you consciously are able to do. You may not be aware of it at all. And that, of course, raises all kinds of questions, which Laura has carefully laid out in this book. And just as a sort of a top-level observation about the book, it is does a very good job of laying out an enormous range of issues, some technical, a lot of them policy, some of them social, sociological. It doesn't necessarily lay out the solutions to the problems. And that's why it's an important book, because we have to figure out what the answers are. So in terms of large and small, the interplanetary internet is in operation now. It's been in operation since 2004. For a variety of reasons, we were forced to send prototype software to Mars in order to get the Mars rovers that arrived in 2004 to function properly and to relay data back. So that was actually pretty exciting for us. You know, if you can send a piece of code 235 million miles away and it works, that's really cool. So that's on the large scale. On the smaller scale, not only do we have small devices and appliances, but as Laura points out, there may be devices that we can ingest. If you want to have a really mind-blowing experience, I had an email from a biologist at the University of California, San Diego, and in the email she said, "I have found an internet inside the cell." And of course, and then the second was, "Oh crap, evolution got to it 4 billion years before Bob Kahn and I did." There is a very complex system inside the cell for signaling among various organelles inside the cell. There are chains of small molecules that are moved around, and it could be interpreted in a kind of a layered architecture. So that's actually pretty interesting. So the basic concepts of the internet, the layering structure and the like, and the openness to new protocols at various layers persists, and it's the reason that the internet has continued to expand in terms of its functionality. But the fact that we can put it in so many different places raises all the problems that Laura has documented in the book.
So Laura, you begin your book with this wonderful, beautiful literary passage, really science fiction. And I wanted to see if I could impose on you to read that passage to us because it's so striking. A passage that imagines a world where the humans disappear and something continues on.
We may get there if we're not careful.
Thank you very much, Anupam, and hi everyone. It's really great to see everyone here, and such an honor to be with Dr. Vint and Cerf and Anupam, and thank President Burwell for the nice introduction, as well as Derek Cogburn. So I'm just thrilled that the book is done and out, and I would be very happy. I asked myself, the opening paragraph was a challenge to myself. I just asked myself, what would the internet be doing if humans suddenly left the Earth? If humans suddenly vanished from Earth, the digital world would still vibrantly hum. Surveillance cameras scanning streets from Beijing to Washington would stream video. Self-driving trucks would haul material around an Australian mine. Russian social media bots would circulate political propaganda. Internet-connected thermostats would regulate home climates. Robots would move merchandise around massive warehouses. Environmental sensors would gauge air pollution levels. A giraffe wandering through a game reserve would trigger a motion detector that opens a gate. Bank accounts would make automatic mortgage payments. Servers would mine Bitcoin. Until electricity stops flowing, cyberspace lives. And I wrote that to try to capture how far digital systems have leapt from the two-dimensional display screens that humans use into the physical world all around us. And really the main idea is that the internet is no longer just a communication system. It's a control network in which more things and people are connected, and in which conflicts over that infrastructure are a proxy for political power. So that was the motivation for that paragraph. This is usually called the Internet of Things. I like to use the term cyber-physical system because I think of it as not just home appliances, but also smart cities, industrial Internet of Things, and also the Internet of Self, in that, as Dr. Cerf already mentioned, the body is now part of the object space with embedded insulin pumps and embedded microchips and all kinds of things. So we can no longer separate the digital sphere from the physical sphere. They're intertwined. And the book was a challenge to myself and my own scholarship to say, well, how does cyber policy have to catch up to that reality?
So, if you don't mind,
of course,
to
please,
turn this into a more interactive thing, I want to react to two things. The first one has to do with the persistence of operation that you described. It would last about 12 hours if we were lucky. And the reason for that is that there is a huge amount of human action required to keep the internet running.
As well as electricity.
Yeah, it's not just electricity, it's
right,
people.
As well.
And it is not a perfect system by any means. And it's so big that something is always broken. No matter where you look, there's something broken that needs to be fixed. So this is important for you to understand that this is an infrastructure which has some fragility in it, and it requires a great deal of maintenance in order to keep it running. So you should thank the people, to the extent that you enjoy the use of the internet, you should thank those people whom you don't know who care every day about keeping it running. So that's the first point. The second point has to do with the use of the term cyber physical systems. This is a popular term at the National Institutes for Standards and Technology as well. I want to resist this for the following reason. It makes it sound as if the virtual world isn't real, and I assure you it is. To give you an example, people speak about robots. I think of a robot as something that takes in real-world information, does a computation, and has an effect on the real world. I will bet you would agree that your bank account is part of the real world and you care a lot about its state. It's entirely possible for a robot to be a piece of software that takes information in, does something, and it makes a change in your bank account, whether it's stealing it or maybe it was a good trade on the stock market and your bank account went up. The point I want to make here is that that which we have been referring to as the virtual world, in fact, is quite real. And therefore, these things blend together. And so when you are thinking cyber-physical, please don't get trapped into the idea that it's all about moving atoms around, because it's not. It's also about moving bits.
Hence I used internet in the title as my description. I want to add one thing to that, just to heap onto that. It is really interesting to be in a group of like-minded experts out there, as all of us do, and every time someone talks about national security or maybe human security, they use the term cyber. And then when they talk about human rights or the digital economy, suddenly they're talking about the internet. And it's very confusing. And they're talking about the same technology. And there's really an opportunity to bring those communities together around the nomenclature.
I actually find, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I know you've got a bunch of questions.
No worries.
But, sorry, this is what you get.
I love it. I love it.
This is what you get, is what you get. Wiggy wig. The whole issue here about the term cyber drives me crazy, because it is supposed to be an adjective, and it's been turned into a noun, and I hate it. So sorry if I've insulted anybody, but it was on purpose. So I would really like, it's not that I don't like the term, I would just like to keep it in its place. And I find it uncomfortable to hear people using it as a noun. At the same time, that which is in the computing environment is not necessarily totally encompassed by internet. There's a lot of computing that isn't internet. And hence this peculiar missing of ships in the night, because when people speak of cyber, they don't necessarily mean the internet. They mean anything associated with computational devices, I think.
Great. So I want to return to this national security question, but connect it again to more the human issues as well. So Laura, you referenced Dick Cheney's heart, which we could discuss, but I want to focus on the kind of internet aspects of Dick Cheney's heart, and allow you to, and if you could tell us a little bit about how you describe this and why this tells us something about the stakes at issue in this coming Internet of Things world that we now live in.
Well, some people here may remember that former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney and his doctor disclosed in, I think it was 2007, that the doctor had ordered the disabling of his wirelessly connected defibrillator, his cardiac implant, in an abundance of caution that someone might assassinate him over the internet. They had disclosed this in a television interview. And that really seemed like a remote possibility, and it is a remote possibility. But I read a lot. Every day I read safety warnings, FDA, U.S. CERT, all the certs. I really stay on top of that. And I saw one day this safety warning about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in radio frequency-enabled implantable cardiac devices. That's a defibrillator. Is the same type. So that really spoke to me, because it's an example of how these very local issues are also very global, in the sense that the most intimate, the most local, personal devices, whether for medical care or something else, can be accessed potentially by an adversary, whether from around the world or more likely in close proximity. So to me, that speaks to the nature of consumer safety issues in the internet, and the fact that this aspect of security is not only about securing the digital economy and digital systems that revolve around finance and industrial systems, but just also our ability to function in the real world and to get health care.
So this raises a really interesting possible challenge. Suppose that the device didn't work unless it was connected to the internet. So one of the things I worry about when we talk about the Internet of Things is, apart from safety, security, privacy, and so on, is autonomy in the following sense, that you want stuff to work in that space, even if the internet isn't accessible. You don't want a house that suddenly stops working, and you certainly don't want a defibrillator that stops working because somehow the internet connection isn't there. There is another hazard, by the way, of putting things like that in your body. My wife has 2 cochlear implants, and she walked through a metal detector. They told us that it was not running. It was. And that EM pulse generated a significant burst of interference. It generated heat in addition, because those wires act like antennas. And it was a very scary moment for us. It wasn't clear whether any serious damage had happened. So I mention that because there are other hazards in addition to the logical hazard of someone invading, getting access to the device because of its network capability, but there are other things you have to worry about too.
So, Vint, I wanted to ask you a question. You've had a front row seat to the internet, which you've helped build. You described earlier about how we're in the internet. The internet is around us. It's not an option that we choose to take on. What are the kind of major challenges that you find now as you're seeing the internet take an even greater role, that internet stack now doing more and more powerful things?
So, first of all, I'm going to challenge your use of the term internet role, taking a role. It's too easy to just blame the internet. Of course, I have good reason to want to defend against that. Although I have to tell you, if you have any kids, the first thing you learn is don't take too much credit when they do a good job, because when they screw up, you don't want to take too much blame. So there are a lot of other people who had fingers in this pie. I'm not the only one, and Bob Kahn isn't the only one either.
Right.
But what I want to get at here is that it is what people do with this infrastructure that counts. Whether what they do is write a piece of software and have a bot running somewhere so that once it's loose, they no longer control it. But they decided to do something. This infrastructure is readily abused. There's no question about that. And you see it in the social media all the time. A lot of what Laura spends time on in the book, especially in the latter portions of the book, is struggling with trying to figure out what to do with abusive behavior, what to do about people who take this technology, take this infrastructure, and then do harmful things. And it gets really complicated because those harmful things happen across international boundaries, which is why it's fortuitous that we're here in the School of International Studies, because one of the studies that we have to do is to figure out what on earth kinds of agreements could we possibly reach that would protect people from harm, regardless of which jurisdiction they happen to be in. The internet was designed to be ignorant of geopolitical jurisdictions. The addressing structure was deliberately designed to be insensitive to the notion of country or national boundary or anything else. That's because it was designed for the Defense Department as an infrastructure for command and control. And can you imagine, suppose that we found the need to invade country X in a couple of weeks. And if we'd had a nationally structured address system, can you imagine going to country X saying, I wonder if we could get some address space from you. We're planning to invade in a couple of weeks, and our command and control system won't work unless we have addresses in country X. So no, we didn't design it that way, and that was deliberate. But that creates its own problem, because now we have a system which is unconscious. The packets pass international boundaries without any recognition at all. So there are massive policy problems associated with trying to come to grips with abuses that take place in this online environment. And as Laura points out in the Internet of Things, it just gets worse because those devices are running autonomously. It's not just artificial intelligence. It had nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It has to do with software that's running on its own. Of course, some of it might be machine learning based or it might be AI, but a lot of it isn't. That's why we should be so concerned about this stuff, because it's running on its own and we're trusting it to do the right thing. Except anybody in this room who's ever had anything to do with software knows that over the last 80 years, we have not figured out how to write a piece of code that doesn't have a bug. So it's bugs in the software that create all the problems.
Which again is one of the reasons that you need to be able to update Dick Cheney's heart defibrillator, right? Because they may find bugs 2 years from the time.
Yeah, on the other hand, depending on who did the update, we don't know what the consequences of that are. What if it disables the defibrillator or it activates it in a way that you didn't want? So you have to know, where did the update come from? And oh, by the way, did it maintain integrity from the source all the way to the place where it was uploaded or downloaded? And that's one of the challenges in the IoT space, is to figure out how to do that safely and securely.
So Laura, Vint described the negative uses that are possible on the internet, people who abuse the internet to do bad things. It's 2020. In the United States, we are focused on the election that's upcoming. We're concerned about the abuses that might be made off the internet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the things that I wrote about in the book and have spoken a lot about in various public fora is the question about, could there be election interference through the Internet of Things? Just raising that scenario. And one of the things I did with a professor from the law school that I taught a class with, is we wrote together a fiction story about David Smith and how this man might not be able to vote, not because of social media influence campaigns, not because of hacking into voter rolls, or not just because of changing votes at all, but just by disrupting the physical infrastructure that and the freedom to vote, whether setting off a Ring doorbell, a false reading there, or setting off an alarm system, or tampering with traffic control systems, or hacking into a system online and saying that there is a hurricane coming, which affects voting. And you do this in swing states. You do it in places where suppressing the vote would elevate something. You don't need to influence social media.
You don't have to do something very sophisticated.
It's very simple. It's very simple. So what I wrote about in the book is just two ways, and the purpose of this is to try to make the case that cybersecurity is the great human rights issue of our time, that not only affects our safety, national security, but also our very democracy. So one way that the IoT can be used is exactly like I just said, you keep people from voting. But another way that it can be used is by making things like phishing attempts more believable. Because when you get an email that has the whiff of truth in it, for example, if your car is able to, if a hacker has information from your car or your phone or anything with GPS that says where you were earlier that day, or maybe at the bank, and you say, oh, when you were at the bank this morning, there was a problem, and you click on this. There are ways to make that more believable. And if anyone ever thought that an individual, like this is an all hands on deck problem that requires an all hands on deck solution, but if anyone ever thought that individuals can't make a difference, think about, I'll just ask the question, who might be president now if someone did not click on a phishing link that led to the release of the DNC emails? So we are all responsible.
Could I amplify that, because it's a really good point. It turns out that we are believing creatures to a remarkable extent. And one of the things which I find the most alarming and disturbing about our ability to believe things that might not be true is that you mentioned whiff of truth, and this is a perfect term. If there is something about which you know not too much, but there is at least one thing in a compendium that you recognize as true from your point of view, then you may be inclined to believe everything else because there was at least something that was true. So when you stir in a little bit of truth, you can incorporate a heck of a lot of untruth, and people may accept that. Another example for you to just think about is when you read a newspaper article about something you know about, almost invariably there's stuff in it that's wrong, and you know that. When you read a newspaper article about something you don't know anything about, you don't have any other basis than to believe it for the most part. And so we run into this really terrible problem in our information space that causes misinformation and disinformation to be more easily absorbed than it should be, which leads me to ask Laura about critical thinking and whether or not that's something that we should be learning how to do better than we do today.
Well, I'll speak on behalf of all of American University, and the answer is a big yes.
And I'll speak on behalf of Georgetown, and the answer is also yes.
Somewhat at
But
Georgetown.
it's work. It is work, and that's part of our problem. It takes work to think critically about things,
Well,
and not everyone's willing to do that.
I have to say I'm very pleased to see very young people here as well, learning critical thinking skills from the get-go. So, Vint, you talked about the borderless internet and the initial design of the internet. But what we're seeing now is the reassertion of borders.
Yep.
The internet is fragmenting. Countries India is, shutting down the internet, at the drop of a hat. Various countries are insisting and trying to create kind of separate domestic spaces. Data sovereignty is a new kind of buzzword. What are the prospects of the kind of open, free, and universal internet that was very much part of your vision from the start, and certainly expressed in the RFC 3271?
So, well, regardless of whether it's free or not, and remember, if it costs something, somehow those costs have to be paid one way or another. Maybe not out of your pocket, but maybe somebody else. That's why our business model at Google works, because the advertisers pay. But this openness is really important because that's what has allowed so much invention to be absorbed into the internet. It didn't start, for example, with the World Wide Web. That came in 1991. Internet's design was way back in 1973. So the openness of the design has been welcoming of new ideas. And the fact that it is borderless and interoperable has been important because you rely on the interoperation to build things that interwork, even if the two devices and their designers never talked to each other and made an agreement. That's why standards are so important. It creates competition. So here we are. There are many different kinds of fragmentation that are showing up. Some of them are blatant and obvious, the Chinese firewall being a very good example of that. Our services are blocked. Our Google services are blocked in China, for example. Then you see more extreme forms of that, where the Russians, for example, just did an experiment to try to isolate their entire piece of the internet and make it work even if it was not connected to the rest of the system. The Iranians are trying to build their own network. But then it also shows up in a more subtle way, where you have blocking taking place at the domain name level. Various and sundry parties will try to inhibit the resolution of a domain name into an IP address, and so you just can't get there. Or maybe there's deliberate attempts to inhibit somebody from getting access to certain kinds of information, so content filtering can take place. It could be the internet service provider, for whatever reason, maybe on direction from the national government, will filter things that keep you from getting access. And then the shutdowns are actually not very hard at all. Basically, if you have no ability to transmit a packet over an optical fiber or a radio link or an Ethernet cable or whatever, the internet doesn't work. I mean, you have to carry the packets somehow. And if you turn all that off, the internet doesn't work. And so we see this, like in the Cameroon, when they shut down during the elections, possibly even for a good reason. I mean, I don't know. I don't mean to imply knowledge here. But I can imagine someone saying, I'm worried about misinformation and disinformation during this period around the election, so I shut the internet off. I wish that were not a choice that was made, that I still think that it's more important to have access to information than not. But you can see lines of reasoning that lead to that. So shutting the internet down is not hard, unfortunately.
So I'm going to ask just a couple more questions, and after that I'm going to turn it over to you. So please start thinking about questions that you might have an opportunity to ask two great pioneers in internet thinking. So Laura, you say in the book that cybersecurity is one of the greatest human rights issues of our time. And that's not a normal way that we talk about cybersecurity. We don't talk about it as a human rights issue. So how can you defend that statement?
No less than the economy, our consumer safety, national security, our financial systems, and my ability to access healthcare in a situation where a ransomware attack might lock down an information system and prevent me from getting an MRI, are all dependent upon keeping networks secure. So I really do believe that it's the great human rights issue of our time, because everything else is dependent. We have the technical mediation of the public sphere. We have the technical mediation of our financial systems. We have the technical mediation of systems of democracy, and we have the technical mediation of everything. And what my book tried to do is to say, it's not just about the public sphere. I have a number of other books, as you know, but one of them is The Global War for Internet Governance that gets into a lot of the technical standards issues, and security, what cybersecurity governance is. But what I do in here is I say, let me just make this point. The security of any other system outside of the Internet of Things is only as secure as the IoT. Because we know from the Mirai botnet, which was a very, very large denial of service attack, that home systems can be hijacked without people knowing about it and attack other systems that have nothing to do with the IoT. So the security of everything, including our digital economy, is dependent on the security of a baby monitor. Now, when you're taking your baby home from the hospital, the last thing you're thinking about is upgrading the security. But I use that as an example because we all are responsible. I call it the internet governance oxymoron because it's not really about governments. It is about governments, but it's in an appropriate regulatory environment. But it's also about the private sector having certain standards of upgradability, authentication of upgrades. It's also about our individual, I don't like this term, people use the term data hygiene, but because it's not just about data either. It is about my responsibility, your responsibility, Google's responsibility, the regulatory environment, and then the institutions of internet governance that keep it all running.
So then, can you point to a success story that should make us more optimistic that if we are thinking about solutions, that some problem that's been identified in the past has actually been fixed or solved in a way that makes us optimistic about the future?
Well, look, first of all, let me just remind you that while I agree with Laura that not only do we want security, but we want safety, we want privacy, we want reliability, because we are relying increasingly on this infrastructure. Think of all the apps that you have in your mobile right now. If they stop working, your day would probably not go the way you intended it to. Or you would get lost on the freeway or whatever it is. So we're relying more and more on these kinds of technologies for our daily lives, and it's important that they meet all of those criteria, not only security, but everything else. Now, in terms of success stories, there's a weird one. It's true that you read all these headlines about everything getting hacked, and they're true. Most things get hacked because of bugs. On the other hand, if you look at the evolution of cryptography and its use in the internet, it's been retrofitted into the system with considerably strong effect. The hypertext transport protocols with the S on the end are now generally considered mandatory in most places, including Google. If you go to a place with our Chrome browser and it is not running the hypertext transport protocol in secure mode, we warn you that you're in an unsecure state. We added DNSSEC, which is a digital signature arrangement, so that when you get a lookup of a domain name and get an IP address back, you can verify that that answer has not been altered by somebody else, that it came from an authoritative source, are helping us do transactions online in a way that allow parties to strongly authenticate themselves. And that turns out to be important not only for human transactions, contract signing and things like that, but it's important for IoT devices. You want an IoT device to refuse to take any commands and to give any information to a thing that can't authenticate itself to the IoT device. And vice versa, the control system doesn't want to talk to an IoT device if it can't recognize it in a strong and authenticated way. So cryptography, especially public key cryptography, has turned out to be a highly powerful, useful tool, and it's been retrofitted into the net. We're seeing more coming. The Border Gateway Protocol, which Laura mentions in her book as well, is the thing that figures out how the packets get passed around in the net, how do they get routed. There is a mechanism that's being standardized by the Internet Engineering Task Force so that the routing information also gets digital signatures on it so we can verify its authenticity. If you don't do that, you can emit routing information that's false and cause data to flow where it doesn't belong. We've had plenty of examples of that. So the answer is that we have found ways of plugging holes in the system. I want to come back to cyber hygiene, even if you don't like that term, because the implication of it is it's everybody's problem, and it is, including us. And so we have to be not stupid about the way in which we use authentication. Picking passwords are a waste of time. Nobody picks good passwords. The good ones are so long that you can't remember them anyway, so you write them on a Post-it thing and you stick it on your laptop. Great security. So two-factor authentication turns out to be really important, and I just happen to have in my pocket my little two-factor authentication dongle, which I carry with me at all times at Google, because I can't get into the systems that I need to get into at Google, even when I'm plugged into the local Google network without this thing, because this little piece of equipment generates a new password, cryptographic password for me every time I log in. And so I'm actually happy to use that. It's a pain in the neck. I'm happy to use it because I feel more secure knowing that Laura doesn't have this. I'm sorry, I don't mean to imply anything about that.
Good choice, good choice.
So the point I want to make here is that while we have lots of challenges and problems in this internet environment, we've also introduced some pretty powerful tools to try to cope with them.
So, Laura, despite the role of the Internet of Things or cyber physical systems or whatever we might call it, and the kind of embedding of the internet into everything, and how, as you rightfully point out, that this makes the internet so much more, in some sense, dangerous than we might have thought. Important, but wrong uses having more critical, negative concerns. You still are optimistic. This is not a dystopian book. This is not a book that says everything is going bad. What makes you optimistic? You have a beautiful passage at the very end that I also want you to close with, but what makes you optimistic?
Well, let me just give a couple of personal stories, and then I'd be happy to read the last paragraph.
Would
Thank you for asking
Thank you.
that. Well, the first one is just a couple of, let me give three personal stories. One is when I was a young Laura, my first computer was a TRS-80 from Radio Shack. And,
same here,
really?
By the way,
okay,
yeah.
So we're dating ourselves very well. And
16
I remember
kilobytes. That was the storage, 16 kilobytes.
And I was kind of a nerd, and Ken Olsen that year had he was the, I think, president of Digital Equipment Corporation, and he said, why would anyone ever want to have a personal computer in the home, right? And so now the question is, why would anyone want to have a personal computer and all the things in a home? And that question is almost moot because we're already there. It's almost more difficult to buy things that are not internet connected than that are internet connected. But anyone who has a family member with a memory issue or Alzheimer's or has a disability understands the importance of this, of having this in the home. The second story is that I just happened to be an engineering student, graduate student at Cornell in 1988 when the Morris worm hit. And that was the first, disruptive outage of the internet that I was aware of. And people predicted the doom of the internet, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. And then the third story is when I was first, in the industry as a security consultant when I was much younger. I remember I could tell you so many stories, but one is that this person that I respected very much and still have a great deal of respect for, Robert Metcalfe, who invented Ethernet, said, this was in 1995, the internet's going to go spectacularly supernova and collapse by 1996. 1996 came, and that's right, and Dr. Cerf challenged him big time on that. 1996 came and went, everything was fine. I could tell you so many stories, and the internet has kept operating. But I do feel like, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt that flow, but I have to tell you, you know what he did? After he admitted that he was wrong, he took his story and put it in a blender with a bunch of water, and he ate his story.
That's right.
However, on stage, in the public setting, however, he checked first to make sure that the ink wasn't going to be toxic.
I didn't know that last part of the story, and as I said, he was very intelligent. Exactly. So I'll read the last paragraph, but the idea is that raising concerns and calling for an all hands on deck response to this I don't feel that it's dystopian. I'm an engineer at heart. I love technology. And I'll just read the closing brief paragraph and the brief epilogue. The merging of cyberspace with the physical world is clearly here, even if this chapter is still in its infancy. Connected sensors and actuators are in everything, including the flesh. Being human and being digital are now physically intertwined. The internet has had many chapters. Its leap from the digital world to the physical world is an extraordinary one. And that epilogue. The week I completed this book, a 5-year-old boy received his first 3D printed prosthetic arm at a Home Depot in Annapolis, Maryland, not far from my home in Washington, D.C. A wonderful sales associate created the prosthetic arm on a Dremel 3D printer using blueprints he downloaded from an organization called Enabling the Future, a group of volunteers around the world who use their 3D printers to fabricate free artificial upper limbs for people in need. The smile on the boy's face, and I encourage you to look this up, is a reminder that building digital trust and security is ultimately about people. The cyber-physical nexus is a human space.
It's beautiful.
Right.
So now we have time for a couple questions from the audience.
And we have microphones in the back.
There's a microphone that's roving.
Especially some students, if you want to chime in. There we go. And introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. My name is Rachel. I'm in the School of Public Affairs. So when you were speaking about critical thinking, especially for younger generations, both of you, and like misinformation and disinformation campaigns, I wanted to talk about information and internet literacy, especially because I feel as though perhaps my generation is more fluent at that. That could be a generalization, but I think it's also important to focus on maybe generations that aren't as fluent in internet literacy, because I wonder if it would be fair to emphasize maybe the importance of that, because I feel that maybe that puts them more at risk for these disinformation campaigns, and to buy into them if they can't identify the difference. So I wondered if you could talk about that.
Could I tell you a story? I was at the Computer Electronics Show a couple of years ago. The AARP asked if I would do a little session for the older users of the internet. My first slide said, some people think that old folks don't know how to use the internet. I have news for you. We invented it. George Sadowski is over there in the chair. Stand up for a second, George. He's another one of the guys that invented the internet. Now, just to the point about critical thinking, it is hard work. And the reason it's so hard is that it's like the scientific method. And I want you to think about this for a minute. I consider myself a computer scientist, and I believe in the scientific method, but here's what it makes you do. If you have a theory, which you've fallen in love with, and you want to convince everybody that your theory is a good representation of the world, then you devise experiments that will allow you to show that your theory will predict the results of the experiment. So you run the experiment. And you get perfect answers. Everything is exactly right except for this point over here. Now, there are two different reactions to that. The first one is, must be measurement error. Let's ignore that. My theory is perfect. The other one is, that's funny. That's the guy that gets the Nobel Prize when he figures out why that point is there. The reason I bring this up is that there are some people who will resist changing their minds about a theory and a belief that they have, even in the face of counterfactual evidence. There are others who are willing to change their mind. It takes a lot of work to change your mind, and that's why critical thinking turns out to be not as well adopted and used as it should be. So I hope to heck you're one of the people who would say, that's funny, and go figure out what's not right about the theory. Laura.
Let me add, I couldn't agree more, but let me also add one other dimension to this. I would encourage you to not be afraid to learn about the technology. And please come take a class with me. Anyone who's taken a class with me knows that we don't just go through the policy issues. I also teach about binary representation, about cryptography, about the domain name system, about internet protocols, and some of the basic foundations of the internet. And no one should be afraid of that. You know, we're so detached from technology now. The people who think they're the most technical are the least technical because they're, you know, sophisticated users. But what's under the hood is where the technology really is. And don't be afraid. You can learn about the technology and demystify that.
Terrific. Thank you.
Oh, they got one with the microphone already. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation, Laura. This book is so exciting for me as somebody who's been itching to have somebody talk about policy regarding cyber physical systems. It's nice to get out of like the engineering space for a little bit. I also wanted to say I appreciate the stories that have happened today. I think that sort of going on what you were saying about getting into technology, it's the stories that bring people in, right? The best, I think, reflection on the Morris worm is written by Joyce Reynolds in an RFC that I cannot remember the number right now, but it's a fantastic story from her perspective. And I think the power of stories to bring people into technology and sort of be, getting under the hood is really important. I had a question about the power of science fiction in making sense of growing complexity and interconnection of systems, both cyber and physical. So at the beginning of your book, it sort of, I think there's echoes of E.M. Forrester's The World Stops, Ray Bradbury's There Will Come a Soft Rain, right? Both of which were written several years ago, 1909 and 1950 respectively, so like a while. So I'm interested in not only the power of storytelling and bringing people in, right, in this call to action that this book is, right, for a very difficult problem that has to be solved by many different people. How do you see this power of storytelling and, bring people into what is a very complex and sort of interconnected issue?
Thank you very much for that question, and I see it as completely intertwined. And may I first just ask this group, how many students are in here from a literature course? raise your hand.
Wow.
And I am thrilled to have you. I'm thrilled to have you, and thank you to Professor Horn for bringing them today. I think that there's a tremendous power in science fiction and fiction in general. It doesn't have to be science fiction. You could debate that term. And also programming like Black Mirror and different kinds of things that you might want to binge watch on television. So I think there's a tremendous power. In fact, I've gotten such a good reception to that opening paragraph that I think I'm going to always do that. But I do want to confess where that came from, if I may. This is my home group here. I have been tasked by my family to put a secret word in every book that I've ever written. The secret word this time was giraffe, and that's why giraffe is in there.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I'd like to respond because storytelling is super powerful. The reason it's powerful is that you can relate to the actors, or if you can relate to the actors, then the story is much more compelling than a list of facts and things like that. Science fiction is often successful because it starts out with a premise. Here's the current state of affairs, and this is where things are going. What happens if we get to an extreme? What happens when an unsustainable path is taken? When it becomes unsustainable, what happens to the society? And so that's, I think, a very powerful tool for us to explore the potential hazards that Laura points out in her book. And so maybe if we're lucky, there will be some science fiction stories that pick up on some of the clues that Laura suggests and paints for us what happens if we don't find a way of coping with some of the problems, the really thorny thicket of problems that are now in front of us. I'm still very optimistic that we can manage that we are not stupid and that humans have the ability to cope with really hard and complex problems. But it won't hurt to have some understanding and incentive for that by seeing what could happen if we don't solve the problem.
Wonderful.
I
should we-
think that's going to have to
Okay,
be
yeah.
our closing comment, and what better comment to end on either a giraffe or the future of our cyber physical and internet systems. So I want to thank our panelists and really acknowledge Laura DeNardis for this amazing book that kept me busy on my holiday reading Laura's book. We're also so fortunate to have here on campus Dr. Vint Cerf, and I just want to thank him for coming and supporting Laura's launch. And I also want to thank all of our partners for putting this on and helping us to put this on. So our colleagues at the Greater Washington, D.C. Internet Society and our live streaming colleagues back there in the back, I see you. Thank you. And also our colleagues at the law school and the cyber security initiative. And also thank you to our colleagues at the Internet Governance Lab. In particular, we want to thank our colleague and our Associate Director, Ken Merrill, for putting this on.